She was an American social reformer and women's rights activist who played a pivotal role in the women's suffrage movement. Good evening, I'm Tyrone Bowman. This is Tyrone Bowman Tonight. The topic of discussion, Susan B. Anthony. Let's get right down to it. Susan B. Anthony was born on February 15th of 1820, and she died the 13th of March of 1906. She was an American social reformer and women's rights activist who played a pivotal role in the women's suffrage movement. Born into a Quaker family committed to social equality, she collected anti-slavery petitions at the age of 17. In 1856, she became the New York State agent for the American Anti-Slavery Society. In 1851, she met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who became her lifelong friend and co-worker in social reform activities, primarily in the field of women's rights. In 1852, they founded the New York Women's State Temperance Society after Anthony was prevented from speaking at a temperance conference because she was female. In 1863, they founded the Women's Loyal National League, which conducted the largest petition drive in United States history up to that time, collecting nearly 400,000 signatures in support of the abolition of slavery. In 1866, they initiated the American Equal Rights Association, which campaigned for equal rights for both women and African Americans. In 1868, they began publishing a women's rights newspaper called The Revolution. In 1869, they founded the National Women's Suffrage Association as part of a split in the women's movement. In 1990, the split was formally healed when their organization merged with the rival American Women Suffrage Association to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, with Anthony as its key force. In 1876, Anthony and Stanton began working with Matilda Joslyn Gage on what eventually grew into the 6-volume history of women suffrage. The interests of Anthony and Stanton diverged somewhat in later years, but the two remained close friends. In 1872, Anthony was arrested in her hometown of Rochester, New York, for voting in violation of laws that allowed only men to vote. She was convicted in a widely publicized trial. Although she refused to pay the fine, the authorities declined to take further action. In 1879, Anthony and Stanton arranged for Congress to be presented with an amendment giving women the right to vote, introduced by Senator Aaron A. Sargent. It later became known colloquially as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, in what was eventually ratified as the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1920. Anthony traveled extensively in support of women's suffrage, giving as many as 75 to 100 speeches per year and working on many state campaigns. She worked internationally for women's rights, playing a key role in creating the International Council of Women, which is still active. So this is trying to give me a hard way to go tonight, but I'll get back to this. Let me just read a paragraph again. Anthony traveled extensively in support of women's suffrage, giving as many as 75 to 100 speeches per year, and working on many state campaigns. She worked internationally for women's rights, playing a key role in creating the International Council of Women, which is still alive or still active. She also helped to bring about the World's Congress of Representative Women at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. When she first began campaigning for women's rights, Anthony was harshly ridiculed and accused of trying to destroy the institution of marriage. Public perception of her changed radically during her lifetime. However, her 80th birthday was celebrated in the White House at the invitation of President William McKinley. She became the first female citizen to be depicted on U.S. coinage when her portrait appeared on the 1979 dollar coin. Susan Anthony was born on February the 15th, as already said, in the year 1820, to Daniel Anthony and Lucy Reed in Adams, Massachusetts. The second oldest of 7 children, she was named for her maternal grandmother Susanna and for her father's sister Susan. In her youth, she and her sister responded to a great craze for middle initials by adding middle initials to their own names. Anthony adopted B as her middle initial because her namesake aunt Susan had married a man named Bronell. Anthony never used the name Bronell herself and did not like it. Her family shared a passion for social reform. Her brothers Daniel and Merritt moved to Kansas to support the anti-slavery movement. There, Merritt fought with John Brown against pro-slavery forces during the Bleeding Kansas crisis. Daniel eventually owned a newspaper and became mayor of Leavenworth. Anthony's sister Mary, with whom she shared a home in later years, became a public school principal in Rochester and a women's rights activist. Anthony's father was an abolitionist and a temperance advocate. A Quaker, he had had a different relationship with his traditionalist congregation, which rebuked him for marrying a non-Quaker, and then disowned him for allowing a dance school to operate in his home. He continued to attend Quaker meetings anyway, and became even more radical in his beliefs. Anthony's mother was a Methodist and helped raise her children in a more tolerant version of her husband's religious tradition. Their father encouraged them, all girls as well as boys, to be self-supporting, teaching them business principles and giving them responsibilities at an early age. When Anthony was 6 years old, her family moved to Pattonville, New York, where her father managed a large cotton mill. Previously, he had operated his own small cotton factory. When she was 17, Anthony was sent to a Quaker boarding school in Philadelphia, where she unhappily endured its severe atmosphere. She was forced to end her studies after one term because her family was financially ruined during an economic turndown known as the Panic of 1837. They were forced to sell everything they had at an auction, but they were rescued by her maternal uncle, who bought most of their belongings and restored them to the family. To assist the family financially, Anthony left home to teach at a Quaker boarding school. In 1845, the family moved to a farm on the outskirts of Rochester, New York, purchased partly with the inheritance of Anthony's mother. There, they associated with a group of Quaker social reformers who had their congregation because of the restrictions it placed, or who left their congregation because of the restrictions it placed. Now, I want you to listen to this. And listen to this very carefully, because this is very heavy. And this is important to know. So in 1845, the family moved to a farm on the outskirts of Rochester, New York, purchased partly with the inheritance of Anthony's mother. There, they associated with a group of social Quaker reformers who had left their congregation because of the restrictions it placed on reform activities, and who in 1848 formed a new organization called the Congregational Friends. The Anthony farmstead soon became the Sunday afternoon gathering place for local activists, including Frederick Douglass, a former slave and prominent abolitionist who became Anthony's lifelong friend. As several others in that group were already doing, the Anthony family began to attend services at the First Unitarian Church of Rochester, which was associated with social reform. The Rochester Women's Rights Convention of 1848 was held at that church in 1848, inspired by the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention, which was held 2 weeks earlier in a nearby town. Anthony's parents and her sister Mary attended the Rochester Convention and signed the Declaration of Sentiments that had been first adopted by the Seneca Falls Convention. Anthony did not take part in either of these conventions because she had moved to, this is a hard name to pronounce, so I'll spell it, Canajohorie. There you have it. In 1846 to be headmistress of the female department of that academy. Away from Quaker influence for the first time in her life, at the age of 26, she began to replace her plain clothing with more stylish dresses, and she quit using the and other forms of speech traditionally used by Quakers. She was interested in social reform, and she was distressed at being paid much less than men with similar jobs. But she was amused at her father's enthusiasm over the Rochester's Women's Rights Convention. She later explained, "I wasn't ready to vote, didn't want to vote, but I did want equal pay for equal work." When the academy closed in 1849, Anthony took over the operation of the family farm in Rochester so her father could devote more time to the insurance business. She worked at this task for a couple of years but found herself increasingly drawn to reform activity. With her parents' support, she was soon fully engaged in reform work. For the rest of her life, she lived almost entirely on fees she earned as a speaker. Anthony embarked on her career of social reform with energy and determination. Schooling herself in reform issues, she found herself drawn to the more radical ideas of people like William Lloyd Garrison, George Thompson, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Soon she was wearing the controversial bloomer dress, consisting of pantaloons worn under a knee-length dress, although she felt it was more sensible than the traditional heavy dresses that dragged the ground. She reluctantly quit wearing it after a year because it gave her opponents the opportunity to focus on her appearance rather than her ideas. In 1851, Anthony was introduced to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had been one of the organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention and had introduced a controversial resolution in support of women's suffrage. Anthony and Stanton were introduced by Amelia Bloomer, a feminist and mutual acquaintance, who had not signed the Declaration of Sentiments and subsequent resolutions. Despite her attendance at the Seneca Falls Convention, Anthony and Stanton soon became close friends and co-workers, forming a relationship that was pivotal for them and for the women's movement as a whole. After the Stantons moved from Seneca Falls to New York City in 1861, a room was set aside for Anthony in every house they lived in. One of Stanton's biographers estimated that over their lifetime, Stanton spent more time with Anthony than any other adult, including her own husband. The two women had complementary skills. Anthony excelled at organizing, while Stanton had an aptitude for intellectual matters and writing. Anthony was dissatisfied with her own writing ability and wrote relatively little for publication. When historians illustrate her thoughts with direct quotes, they usually take them from her speeches, letters, and diary entries. Because Stanton was homebound with 7 children while Anthony was unmarried and free to travel, Anthony assisted Stanton by supervising her children while Stanton wrote. One of Anthony's biographers said, "Susan had become one of the family and was almost another mother to Mrs. Stanton's children." A biography of Stanton says that during the early years of their relationship, Stanton provided the ideas, rhetoric, and strategy. Anthony delivered the speeches, circulated petitions, and rented the halls. Anthony prodded and Stanton produced. So this is a fascinating life about Susan B. Anthony. This is to be continued. So as I close out this segment for now, and I'll be back later on with part 2 of Susan B. Anthony. And her life is worth talking about here on Tyrone Bowman Tonight. Don't forget to check out the Higher Dimensions School for the Prophets at www.schoolfortheprophets.com. Higher Dimensions School for the Prophets at www.schoolfortheprophets.com. comma. So remember the topic of discussion for this evening, because I will be back with part 2 of this American social reformer and women's rights activist, Susan B. Anthony. Never surrender, never quit.